Good afternoon, fellow puppeteers, and welcome back to this week's episode of What the Heck Is That?
It's your hosts, Pippi and Poppy, and today we're here to discuss the decade marked by the post-World War II boom, the dawn of the Cold War, and the Civil Rights Movement in the United States.
I'm so excited. I've said it once, Pippi, and I'll ask it again. What the heck is that?
First, we're going to discuss the main characteristics of society in the 1950s. Tell us, local expert, what are some important things to know about the 1950s?
Well, in the 50s, the United States was one of the world's strongest military powers. The economy was booming, and suburban houses and other consumer goods were available to more people than ever before.
Wow, the 50s seem like such a peaceful and innovative era.
They kind of sucked. The world was on the brink of an atomic warfare, and people lived in constant fear of communism and death. Let's take a look at this clip that they played in schools teaching children what to do if a nuclear bomb was ever about to be dropped on the school.
Dum-dum, diddle-dum-dum, diddle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, duck and cover. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association.
Produced by Archer Productions in...
And on top of the looming threat of war, so many groups in the 50s were still facing unequal treatment. Racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. were all super prevalent and defined the general tone of the society in the 50s.
Is that like how women were forcefully encouraged to stay home and take care of their families?
Exactly. Before Betty Friedan wrote her novel, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, the feminist movement died after the suffragettes from the early 1900s. So, white women could still vote, but they were socially oppressed. Black women technically could vote after the 19th Amendment, but due to Jim Crow laws, many people were prevented from voting because of the discrimination until the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Wow, they really did kind of suck. I wonder what it was like to be a woman in the 1950s.
Gee golly, Patty, I just love my husband so much.
Me as well, Betty.
My arm sure gets tired from all this mixing.
Don't complain. We're lucky to have such wonderful husbands who will go to work every day and barely give us any attention.
What a lovely thought, Patty. I'll never take my wonderful servitude life for granted again.
Of course not. If our husbands didn't provide for us, what will we ever do? Our tiny brains are only fit for bearing and raising children, not doing something as complex as working a minimum wage job. If the wives were forced into these roles, I wonder what it was like for a whole family.
Let's take a look. Roll the tapes.
First of all, daughter has changed from school clothes to something more festive. Dressing a little makes her feel and consequently look more charming. Even the table takes on a special air. Mother, too, changes from her daytime clothes. The women of this family seem to feel that they owe it to the men of the family to look relaxed, rested, and attractive at dinner time. Brother is spending an hour before dinner catching up on his homework. He has plans evening. Perhaps that explains the telephone call. But he won't spend a lot of time on the phone either. When there are several members of the family to be considered, it is not a good idea for one member to monopolize the phone. And it is never good to allow telephone conversations to interfere with studies. Is it that late? Dad'll be here any minute. Better tell Mother she's needed in the kitchen. Brother notices the time and realizes that he must put things in order and clean himself up in time for dinner. Hello there. Junior is always in a hurry, particularly for dinner. But first there's a cleanup job to do on this young man. Brother takes it upon himself to help share Junior's responsibility for keeping their room in good order and keeping Junior in good order, too. Punctuality is stressed in this household. By that I mean hair is combed and faces and hands scrubbed before the boys come to the table so they won't delay the meal. Now, mother and daughter put the finishing touches on the dinner. Father, too, looks forward to this date with the family. He has had a hard day at the office, and in his briefcase are some contracts which must be looked over tonight. But in the meantime, he will relax at dinner with those he loves. A simple centerpiece made from some flowers which grow in the backyard is another of daughter's contributions to the dinner. But it takes up a little too much room, so she moves it to the sideboard. These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. This is the time for pleasant discussion in a thoroughly relaxed mood. They don't pick this time of the day to spring unpleasant surprises on Dad. If they have disagreeable news, they'll postpone the discussion until another time. And this is no time to dun Father for a raise in your allowance, new clothes, or argue about other financial matters. Ah, dinner time. Yes, Mother, Junior remembered to clean up. Brother seats Junior. Then helps Mother to her chair as he would his best girl. Well, the dinner date has begun, and they're all happy about it.
That was so interesting. My brain is just booming with all of the knowledge.
The word boom was used to describe many things in the 1950s. The booming economy, the booming suburbs, and the baby boom.
Oh yeah, I remember hearing about this. It began after World War II ended. The Americans were so eager to have babies because they were sure the future held nothing but peace and prosperity. I'm not sure exactly how many babies were born though.
About 4 million babies were born each year in the 1950s. And by the time the baby boom diminished in 1964, there were about 77 million baby boomers.
That's too many babies. So there were a ton of kids and young people during the 1950s.
That defined a lot of the generation's music. Young people's interest in music and willingness to rebel against the social norms actually resulted in the genre of rock and roll. For example, stars like Elvis Presley really riled up the older folks because of his unruly dancing and scandalous music.
Huh.
Now for another round of Related or Not! And I'm your host, Hosty McHostess. To play, I'm going to give you 2 topics, and your job is to tell me if they're related or not! Okay, let's begin. This week's scenarios both occurred in 1957. Number 1, the phrase, "In God We Trust," was added to the US dollar bill. And number 2, Elvis's hit single, "Jailhouse Rock," was released and hit the charts. Now, are those related or not?
Well, the emergence of rock and roll sent those older religious Americans into a swirl. They literally refer to it as the devil's music. So I think I'm gonna go with related.
Probably. So Elvis really did shake up the world, and his impact is still widely acknowledged today. Everyone knows who Elvis Presley is.
Also, rock and roll wasn't the only genre created in the 50s. The R&B of the 50s combined jazz, doo-wop, blues, and gospel to create a unique sound during the decade. It also spurred the creation of genres like soul, Motown, and even funk music.
Didn't a lot of these genres originate from the African American communities?
Yes, which leads us to our next topic, the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement.
Hey, local expert, what even was the Civil Rights Movement, and how did it impact the country as a whole?
The Civil Rights Movement began when...
Get out of my seat.
No.
Wow, she seems like such a brave lady. I can't believe she had the courage to stand up for herself like that.
Well, it's great that she did, because her act was one of the kickstarts of the whole movement and inspired a lot of Americans to start speaking out against the racial injustices happening all over the country.
African Americans had already been fighting against racial discrimination for centuries. However, during the 1950s, the struggle against racial segregation entered the mainstream of American life. For example, in 1954, after Brown v. the Board of Education, the Supreme Court declared that separate educational facilities for African American children was not constitutional. This overturned the prior Supreme Court decision of separate but equal.
Wow, it really seems like you're the expert here.
Well, because it is unequal. What happened after that?
Many people resisted this ruling and withdrew their children from public schools and enrolled them in all-white segregation academies, where violence and intimidation were used to prevent African Americans from asserting their rights. In 1956, more than 100 Southern congressmen signed a Southern manifesto declaring they would do whatever it takes to defend segregation. Obviously, the efforts of the Southerners failed, and the Civil Rights Movement celebrated its first major success. At the time of Rosa Parks' resistance, though, the movement was not as widespread, so she was still arrested and jailed for simply refusing to give up her seat.
Well, the 1950s really was a complex and interesting time period. So much happened in only 10 years, and most of it is still extremely relevant and influential to this day.
Yes, I can't wait to see what we learn about next week. Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in next week for another episode of What the Heck Is That?
I wonder what Betty Fidesz is going to do with one hand behind her back like that.
Come with me, and I'll show you what every one of you can do single-handed. Here, you can tune in this wonderful new Westinghouse television set with just one hand like this, because it has the sensational new Westinghouse single-dial control. There's no more fussing with several dials. You just turn this one dial, and you're tuned in perfectly. Now, in the set that you're watching now, does a channel ever come in like this and give you only sound? Or, when the picture comes in clear like this, is the sound ever so hard to get that all you hear is this? Well, that never happens with this wonderful new Westinghouse set because of the miracle of Westinghouse synchro tuning. Picture and sound come in together just like that. And once tuned, this set stays locked in tune. Now, here's something that will really amaze you. Here's the size of the screen in most table models. Now, let's compare it with this new Westinghouse screen. There. Now, that's quite a difference, isn't it? Engineering improvements give you a huge 17-inch rectangular screen in this wonderfully compact new Westinghouse set. And it gives you a black glass tube, which means that you get a clear, sharp picture even in daylight. Now, this set also has a built-in antenna, and that means that in many areas, there's no installation of any kind. You save the entire cost of it. So why put up with a set that isn't really up to date and has an old-fashioned small screen when you can get this wonderful new 17-inch Westinghouse set at a modest price? Just ask your dealer for the Westinghouse Linwood. There's no other set in its price range that compares with it. You can be sure if it's Westinghouse.